Welcome to the first in a series of conversations that we are hosting at Solidarity with the Persecuted Church with leading experts on the situation of Christian communities around the world who suffer persecution, unfortunately a global phenomenon. My name is Greg Gross. I serve on the board of directors of Solidarity with the Persecuted Church, a grant-giving entity, a charity that helps these communities to sustain themselves in situations of persecution. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Ambassador Michael Gfoeller. Ambassador, thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here, Greg. Thanks for the invitation.
Ambassador Gfoeller is one of the leading experts on U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, Europe, and around the world. Ambassador Gfoeller's diplomatic career representing the United States has brought him to some of the most challenging postings that a U.S. diplomat could serve in. Among them, Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Iraq during the height of the war in Iraq, Moscow, Russia, Armenia, Moldova, Poland, and Belgium. His expertise extends far beyond even this wide-ranging number of countries. His assignments included being the senior State Department advisor to General David Petraeus, commander of U.S. CENTCOM, during the height of the Iraq War, and earlier for 4 years as Deputy Chief of Mission and Chargé d'Affaires at the U.S. Embassy in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. And for those of you that don't know, the DCM position in an embassy is like the XO, and basically they do everything and deal with every problem and serve as a surrogate ambassador in all situations. So it's a critical role. Following his retirement from the Foreign Service, Ambassador Gfoeller has served in numerous roles, among them senior positions advising or in corporate leadership at Fortune 100 companies operating in the Middle East and advising many other firms with large multinational presences. He has also founded the Gfoeller Renaissance Foundation, which we'll talk about later in the interview. It's fascinating, involving Armenia, and has published a series of books on Central Asia, Egypt, Italy, Armenia, and Myanmar. And he speaks 9 languages. And the last thing I'll say in this long introduction is that one of the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and later Secretary of State said of Ambassador Gfoeller in his service in Saudi Arabia that this is a man who is among the most erudite, knowledgeable people about the Middle East and global affairs that he has ever met. And so it is my great pleasure. Thank you again for joining us, and I will dig in. So
Great.
The way we can start is to talk about the history of the Christian communities in places like the Middle East and Central Asia, because people in the United States and in Europe often don't understand the depth and length of presence of Christian communities in these areas.
As an old lady said to me once in Atlanta, Georgia, if English was good enough for Jesus Christ, it's good enough for me. So there's this sense, that really at the end of the day, Christianity is a Western religion, but it's an Eastern religion. Its roots are in the East. Its roots are in Palestine, in Israel, in Jordan, in Egypt. Christ was born in Bethlehem, not in upstate New York. And the earliest Christian communities were in parts of the world where you now have the nations of Israel, Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, Iraq. These are where the oldest Christian communities are to be found. And of course, right next to them is Armenia, which is the oldest surviving Christian country, having become a Christian country in 301 AD, followed shortly thereafter by Georgia and Ethiopia. None of these are, European countries. None of them have anything to do with Western European culture, but they're the real roots of Christianity. And the oldest Christian churches are in Georgia, Armenia, and Ethiopia to this day. Armenia accepted Christianity in 301 AD, Georgia in 326, and the date for Ethiopia is a little bit more fluid, but sometime between 320 and 330. So right about the same time.
Well, and this is so important, and I know many people in America and Europe who, because of the depredations of ISIS in Iraq and Syria and elsewhere, learned about these communities first time and suddenly realized that there's this depth of Eastern Christianity, which is so profound and important in a very vulnerable state. And so maybe we can start with Iraq. You were present, I know, in the south of Iraq. I was serving in the Defense Department, and we worked on some of the same issues, actually. But you had a broader understanding of what was happening in the north of Iraq. You have been in Erbil, which is the Kurdish part of Iraq, from a number of occasions, even beyond your service during the war as a diplomat.
A swath of land stretching from northern Iraq through northern Syria into Lebanon is one of the oldest Christian realms, if you will, in the world. I mean, you find monasteries and churches there going back to the early Christian centuries, individual buildings that go back to the 4th and 5th century. Only in Armenia do you get even older Christian churches that are still functioning. But you have Christian communities being formed there really in the 1st and 2nd century AD. So there, of course, Jesus spoke Aramaic. Aramaic is still a spoken language in parts of Syria. Aramaic is still the liturgical language, along with Arabic, of the Syrian Orthodox Church, many of whose adherents are in this country now. We have 300,000 or so Syrian Orthodox Christians living in the United States now. Many of them emigres, refugees from Syria, many of them converts to Orthodoxy. So yeah, it's incredibly important. And what I saw, of course, happen in Iraq was an interesting process, a tragic process in a lot of ways, because during the dictatorship of Saddam Hussein, the Christian minority lived a life that can be best characterized as tolerated second-class citizens. They were second-class citizens, but they were not subject to particular persecution because the dictatorship of Saddam was a secular dictatorship. Well, it was a brutal dictatorship, particularly brutal against the Shiite Muslims in the south. Saddam, after the first Gulf War, massacred at least 1 million people among his own population, mostly Shia, but also at least several 100,000 Kurds. The Christian population escaped largely unscathed in that particular instance. When we overthrew Saddam and liberated Iraq, something happened that I don't think anybody anticipated, but there was an upsurge of activity by political parties that were religiously motivated, particularly the Shiite political parties, but also what ultimately came to be known as ISIS, which is a fusion between pro-Saddam diehards and Al-Qaeda elements. This grew up in the Mosul Valley, the Nineveh Plain. And so between these two forces, persecution against Christians increased dramatically. And the net result was a large outmigration of Christians from Iraq, mostly to Western Europe and the United States, so that the Christian population in Iraq has fallen from about 1.5 million in 2003, 2004, to maybe 150,000 today. Those people haven't been killed, they simply emigrated, they left the country. I was talking with a Palestinian Christian friend who reminded me that this whole process goes back to 1979 with the Iranian Revolution. And of course, so many of the religious parties in Iraq are linked closely to Iran. It was in 79, said my friend who was living as a child in Kuwait when the revolution happened, that he could feel the atmosphere changing, and he and his Palestinian parents got out and immigrated to the United States as refugees by 1981 in order to avoid the oppression that was coming.
One of the experiences that happened in the United States, as you know, was that because of the depredations of ISIS, there was a growing concern among many Americans about, and Europeans and others, about the persecution of Yazidis and Christians in Iraq and Syria and other minorities by ISIS. And it became a bit of a battle of sorts to convince the State Department and the then Secretary of State to actually talk about what was clearly a genocide being committed against Christians. And there was a bit of a struggle to get a resolution through Congress. We as an organization were involved with that, SPC, and convincing the then Secretary of State to actually acknowledge that the Christians were being persecuted. And I know we talked about this before in our personal conversations, but talk a little bit about the culture of the State Department and why it can be so difficult to get the State Department, and I would say USAID as well in its own capacities, to actually focus on this issue of the persecution of Christians.
Well, if I can be blunt, there's a tendency in state and in USAID, at least this is something I observed during my nearly 30 years working for the government, and then later on in the region as a private citizen. I spent all told over 30 years in the Middle East. I would say that there's a tendency to view human rights concerns in general and religious freedom concerns in particular as a distraction from our real business. There's a tendency to think that we really need to be talking about is arms deals and oil prices and commercial negotiations and that sort of thing. And at the end of the day, the persecution of religious minorities isn't something we should concern ourselves with, even though we have an absolutely, solid American tradition of being interested in these issues overseas. I mean, the reason we have such a large Armenian community in this country is that a million Armenians fled to the United States and to Western Europe, during the course of World War I. So our interest in these kind of issues goes back at least to World War I, if not much further than that. After all, we're a country of immigrants, and all of us left the old country because things weren't so great there to begin with, and often the issues we were facing, were issues of religious persecution. I mean, heck, it goes back to before the founding of the nation, to the Pilgrims. It's an issue we should be concerned about.
Right, and obviously the situation of Christians, ISIS is still present to some extent in Syria and Iraq, but doesn't control the territory it did, and Christian communities are trying to reestablish themselves in places, for example, like I visited as a part of SPC Karakosh, which is east of Mosul. Mosul itself is a challenge. Some of the oldest churches in the world are in Mosul, but Christians are having troubles reestablishing themselves. Karakosh is a similar situation where Iranian-supported militias and others are operating, and so there's clearly a desire to drive out Christians from these communities, and so it's still a challenge. One of the things that you had mentioned is the representation of groups, immigrant communities, concerned about where they're from, ethnically or religiously, and I think an issue that we can talk about in that regard is China as well, where clearly the PRC, the People's Republic of China, has an extraordinarily harsh attitude about independent Christian communities. And
Absolutely.
maybe you could talk a little bit about that. And again, how much does that agenda fit into the broader U.S. foreign policy, State Department list of concerns?
Well, I contrast our China policy with our policy toward the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union were really interested in pushing back against and combating Soviet restrictions on freedom of religion. Just as a reminder to people who might be too young to remember this, but all religious activity was forbidden in the Soviet Union. And the penalty during various periods in Soviet history, the penalty for possessing a Bible at home could be death or many years in a labor camp or prison camp. So people took this stuff very, very seriously. I remember when I was working in the former Soviet Union, we really cared about these issues. I worked a great deal on them. So did many colleagues of mine. We felt passionately about it. And ultimately, one of the successes we can claim is that substantial degrees of religious freedom exist in all the countries that used to make up the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact now. And obviously the glory, if you will, or the credit for their liberation goes to the people themselves and those countries who threw off communism. But I'm proud to say as an American that we were helping them to overthrow those tyrannies. And we seem to be oddly silent about the persecution of Christians in China. Maybe it's a business as usual mentality. I suspect that's the case. We've let the Chinese get away with a host of human rights abuses. One need only mention the Uyghurs. Somehow, no one mentions that in polite society all that often, although we ought to. But the Chinese are doing the best they can, as far as I can see, to cover up the fact that Christianity is growing more rapidly in their country than anywhere else in the world. And from a Christian population of only a few million as late as the 1940s, they now have a Christian population of, credible sources would say, 100 million out of 1.3 billion people. So the numbers are significant. And it's quite possible that China will number as many as 250 million Christians within a decade. So the numbers are growing rapidly through conversion. Most of them belong not to the state-recognized and controlled churches, the state-controlled version of the Catholic Church, for example, or the Protestant churches, but to the unregistered house churches. And there seems to be explosive growth going there. The only country I know of where Christianity seems to be growing as quickly underground would be Iran.
We'll talk about Iran. I mean, look, maybe let's move west. Let's start with another country of great concern to people who know about the situation of Christians in this country, which is Pakistan. I'm going to make my way west. So
Sure.
Talk about Pakistan, because Pakistan, there's clearly a targeting taking place by radical political parties and others in Pakistan. As you know, I've dealt with Pakistan in my work in the US government extensively, including in the most difficult areas like Waziristan.
When I was a political advisor to David Petraeus at US Central Command, we worried more about Pakistan than we did about the other 20 countries in the CENTCOM area of responsibility, which stretched from Kazakhstan to Egypt. So, from Kazakhstan's border with China to Cairo, it was a huge area. Pakistan, of course, is a survivor in historical terms of Mughal India. Traditional India had a dual culture, very strong Muslim strand, a very strong Hindu strand going back into the depths of antiquity. Islam really makes itself known in the peninsula as early as the 7th century with the first Arab conquests in what's now Pakistani territory, or in the Punjab Valley. And so, you have an ancient tradition there. And when British hegemony in India ended, and the division took place between Pakistan and India, of course, millions of lives were lost. The small Christian population in Pakistan remained, along with the residual Hindu population, and both populations, the Christians and the Hindus, have been subjected to pretty systematic oppression and really terrorization ever since then. Pakistan is deeply tied to us, by security ties, economic ties. We could, if we wanted to, do a lot more to promote religious toleration there. There are other parts of the Islamic world in which toleration of Christians is increasing dramatically, and it would be great if the international community could incentivize Pakistan to move in the same direction.
Obviously, the concern about the US-India relationship, nuclear weapons, potential nuclear war between these countries, there's so many concerns, and how to get these religious freedom concerns inserted into the process. And as you know, because I know you've worked on these issues quietly over many years, it can actually change a country for the better on all the bigger questions when minorities like Christian communities are treated better. So let's work our way west. We're already planning on having a conversation with you later about Armenia and all the issues it's facing, and especially on its eastern border. But maybe for now, let's talk about what you're doing in Armenia with your foundation, which is fascinating, and of course involves this question of the history of these communities going back to ancient times.
Well, what we're doing is exploring 2 million years of archaeology. And we had no idea what we were going to find until we started digging. Decades ago, I was the deputy chief of mission in Yerevan, right after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And my main task was to try to figure some way to jumpstart the Armenian economy, which was in a state of collapse. And so I did the obvious thing, and I traveled around the country and talked to people and looked at how they were making a living. Most people had fallen back into subsistence agriculture. People were cutting down telephone poles to burn the wood in their fireplaces. I mean, there just wasn't a lot going on economically. And the first thing I noticed was that they had a rich agricultural tradition and some of the best volcanic soil in the world, and an unbelievable archaeological inheritance. I'd had the good fortune to study in Egypt as a very young man, and I had never seen that density of ruins. The situation where you can't travel a kilometer without hitting another castle, temple, fortress, ruined city, you name it. And it's just, in my own simple-minded way, it seemed, boy, they should be building an economy based on tourism, on archaeological tourism, because this is a country that could be more interesting to visit than Greece or, Italy, even Egypt. It's on the level with Egypt, actually. And so I started working quietly in that direction. And once I had left Armenia, I set up a private foundation to fund archaeological excavations on the sort of if you build it, they will come theory. Our theory was if you dig it, they will come. So we dug up a few ancient cities. We had some major discoveries early on. And before you knew it, Armenia was one of the leading archaeological countries in the world, and the tourists came after. Just last year, they had 3 million tourists in a country of 3 million people. And so it's now, tourism is the largest sector in the economy, followed by bespoke agriculture. They produce a massive amount of agricultural goods, very high quality, high specialization, and they export 95% of it. So it's gone from being a poor country of subsistence agriculture to being a middle income country, about as well off on a per capita basis as some places in Eastern Europe. So they're they're doing much better than they used to be, and they're growing rapidly, about 7% a year GDP growth. And of course, what gave us the idea was neighboring Turkey, because Turkey did the same thing. They began to leverage their archaeological resources in the 80s and 90s. And what is it? Turkey gets something like 60 to 70 million tourists a year. Tourism there also is one of the biggest industries. So it's a formula you can apply in a lot of places. We did discover the world's oldest winery. It's 6,100 years old. And over 10 years of experimentation, we managed to hack, as it were, the ancient winemaking process and recreate the oldest known wines. With due respect to Georgia, right next door, they have ancient wine too. But we do have the oldest known winery, and we know exactly how it was made because we found the installation intact.
Fascinating. Well, let's move west again, back to the Persian Gulf. You served at DCM in Saudi Arabia. You began to talk about the situation of Christians in places like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, UAE, the Persian Gulf states in general. Let's talk about that and what you have observed in terms of difficulties and progress.
Well, I think we have to start with a baseline of what is the position of Christians under Islamic law. So under Islamic law, Christians, Jews, and other non-Muslims are viewed as dhimmis, which is to say minorities having a secondary legal status. So it's just a fact. In addition, conversion from Islam to another religion, technically under Islamic law, is a death penalty offense. Now, in the really enlightened monarchies of the Persian Gulf, obviously this punishment isn't actually applied anymore, particularly in Saudi Arabia under Mohammed bin Salman. They have a very humane approach to applying the law. But the fact of the matter is that it is illegal to engage in public religious celebrations of any kind other than Islam. And unless you're in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia, it would also be a good idea not to engage in Shiite religious ceremonies, unless you're in the eastern province. So, yeah, against this background, what we can see is growing tolerance and open-mindedness. In the United Arab Emirates, they have 40 functioning Christian churches. The population of the UAE is about 10 million people. 10% of that number are Christians. Almost all of them are immigrants who come to the UAE to work. In many cases, those immigrant families have been there for generations, 2 or 3 generations, and they're part and parcel of the country. The same thing can be seen in Kuwait and in Qatar. Churches function. There have been Christian churches operating in Kuwait for generations, ever since the 50s and 60s. In Qatar, you have a very open attitude toward Christianity as well. In Saudi Arabia, there are no functioning Christian churches, although there is some discussion, I wouldn't say at governmental levels yet, but in society, about following the example of the UAE. So I think this is something that we need to take into account when thinking about the politics of the region. People sometimes say that there's no point in trying to advance values like religious toleration and respect for other traditions in the countries of the Middle East, but it's working in the Persian Gulf.
Now, let's go further west to Egypt, because the situation of the Coptic church there is always precarious, and yet it's such a large presence. Egypt has had foreign ministers who were Coptic. They've often served senior roles in government in Egypt in the past. Talk a little bit about that situation.
There are 2 big trends I think people should be aware of in Egypt. One is that ever since the assassination of President Sadat, which took place right about the same time as the overthrow of the Shah in Iran, and can indeed be seen as an equally important event and as another victory, unfortunately, for Islamic extremists. Ever since then, there's been a strong trend or tendency in Egyptian culture toward more extremism in the country's Islamic life, unfortunately. Now, there are powerful forces in Egypt pushing back against that trend, but anybody who's traveled there regularly over the last 40 or 50 years, like I have, has seen the culture change. Under President Sisi, there's been pushback against this tendency. Sisi is one of the most interesting leaders in the Arab world because he really believes in an idea of citizenship and nationhood that transcends sectarian or religious adherence. And so he constantly refers to the Coptic population as fellow Egyptians. And this is something really unique. Egypt is full of Coptic churches. The Copts are in many ways the oldest segment of the population. Their liturgical language is ancient Egyptian. It's the last. It's the version of. It's a spoken version of ancient Egyptian that existed during the Ptolemaic and Greco-Roman period. So it's quite amazing to go to a Coptic church or monastery and listen to a liturgy in that particular language. And of course, Egypt is the language to which Saint Joseph took the Virgin Mary and the Christ child when an angel told him in a dream to leave Palestine and to protect the life of his son. So if you reconceive the Holy Family as, economic and political refugees fleeing to Egypt to escape political trouble with Herod in Palestine, it's really interesting to look at them that way. This is the kind of place they would have come, because what's now Cairo was even then a major port city and an entrepot with nationalities from all over the world.
Of course, in this part of the world, when you talk about Jesus and Mary, it's personal. These are these communities. They know this is where Jesus was. This is where Mary was. This is where the apostles were. The traditions are extraordinary, and Egypt is so important. Solidarity with the persecuted church explicitly works with local churches.
It's the only way to operate. You have to work through the local churches. Nothing else will work. Otherwise, half the aid will go in corruption, waste, fraud, and mismanagement. You've got to work with the local churches because they have the greatest ethical incentive to do the right thing. When you're dealing with a monk, a priest, a pastor, you have, nothing's 100% in this world, but you have a very high chance of most of that aid being spent the way it should be spent. Plus, they know the local community, so they're going to spend it much more intelligently than you could. And this is the philosophy I actually found used in developing my archaeological foundation. It's a different kind of aid, if you will, but we've helped an entire country recover much of its historical legacy, and we did that by making sure that everybody involved, except for me, was local, because local people of good character and integrity simply know the lay of the land better, and you'll get 10 times as much done. And I can't think of better people to work with than Christian ministers, priests, or monks or nuns.
Although I'm knowing your knowledge and engagement with Armenia, I suspect you are an honorary local. And we'll talk about that in a conversation we'll have in the future about Armenia specifically, and let's say the broader Turkic country world. Going even further west from Egypt and southwest into sub-Saharan Africa, SPC, as you know, has been very involved in Iraq, Syria, and other parts of the world, but we really are focusing now on the situation of Christians in Nigeria. And I know you have some experience and knowledge of that situation.
Like many people, I'm very concerned by the situation in Nigeria because the temperature seems to be rising in terms of anti-Christian sentiments and acts. Boko Haram is still very active in Nigeria. Similar movements are active all across the Sahel. We recently lost our largest base for combating Islamic extremist movements in that part of the world in Niger, right next door. So that, of course, was not desirable. This is producing an outflow of Christians from that part of the world. The Igbo community in the United States is flourishing as a result. Igbos are now, if I'm not mistaken, on a per capita basis, the wealthiest ethnic group in the United States. So Nigeria's losses are gain, but I'm really quite concerned that the same factors that have led to huge outflows of Christians from countries like Iraq are now at work in West Africa as well.
What can we do?
We need to be very frank that we expect a much higher standard in terms of religious toleration in Nigeria, a democracy, than what we're seeing right now.
Thank you, Michael, for these observations. SPC is really focusing on this. We're going to be sending a team there to do an investigation and form the relationships with the local church leaders. We already have connections with some of the bishops to try to, really get a feel on the ground about what these communities need and what the local church leaders say they need in order to sustain themselves. This was a fascinating examination of the history, the geopolitics, and of course, what can be done to influence U.S. policy in helping there. And so thank you again for these amazing insights.
It was my pleasure. And thank you for shining such a bright and clear light on a crucial issue. We as a country always do better when our foreign policy tracks with our fundamental values. And religious freedom is a core American value. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you for all you're doing.
Thank you.